The envelope was thick, $50,000 in cash, bundled and handed across a polished table inside a rented townhouse on W Street in Northwest Washington, D.C. The man who took it did not hesitate. He fanned the bills, smiled, and said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "Money talks in this business," he told the man sitting across from him, "and bullshit walks." What the congressman from Pennsylvania did not know, what none of them knew, was that every word, every gesture, every dollar changing hands was being captured on hidden Betamax cameras mounted inside ordinary furniture. The FBI was watching, and the FBI had been watching for a very long time. This is the story of Operation ABSCAM. It ran from October 1978 through February 1980. Nearly 16 months of one of the most elaborate and legally contested undercover stings ever run by the United States government. By the time it was over, one sitting United States senator, 6 members of the House of Representatives, the mayor of an entire city, and members of a city council had all been caught on camera accepting money or promising favors in exchange for it. The operation became a landmark in FBI history, a flashpoint in constitutional law, and a permanent stain on the reputation of the American Congress. And it all started with a convicted con man who had nowhere left to run. Melvin Weinberg was not an FBI agent. He was never going to be confused for one. Born in 1924 in New York City, Weinberg had spent most of his adult life running scams, fraudulent loan operations, phony advance fee schemes, confidence tricks that fleeced investors out of millions. He was charming, relentless, and extraordinarily good at reading people. He was also, by 1977, in serious legal trouble. Federal prosecutors had him on fraud charges that could send him to prison for years. Faced with that reality, Weinberg made a decision that would reshape American history. He offered to work for the FBI. The deal was straightforward. Weinberg would cooperate with the Bureau in exchange for a suspended sentence and a consulting fee. The FBI assigned Special Agent James Foreign of the New York field office to manage him. What Foreign discovered almost immediately was that Weinberg was not just a useful informant, he was a virtuoso. He understood the psychology of greed better than anyone the Bureau had ever worked with. He knew how to find people who wanted money and how to make them believe the money was real. The FBI began to understand what it had. The initial mandate had nothing to do with Congress. The operation launched in October 1978 as a property theft fencing sting. The Bureau wanted to use Weinberg to recover stolen paintings and other high-value art. The FBI created a fictitious company as the front. They called it Abdul Enterprises Limited. The name was chosen to suggest Arab oil wealth, which in the late 1970s meant bottomless money. The fictional backer was a made-up Arab sheikh named Kambir Abdul Rahman, said to be a member of a wealthy Gulf family looking to invest in the United States. FBI agents would play the sheikh's American representatives. Weinberg would make introductions and run interference. The fencing operation worked, but something more interesting quickly emerged. As Weinberg moved through his network of contacts, a pattern appeared. Certain people with political connections, people who knew city officials, people who had access to those who made government decisions, kept hinting at what else they could offer. Not just stolen goods, favors, influence, the ability to make problems disappear or permits materialize. The FBI made a decision. The target would change. The new direction required new infrastructure. The Bureau rented a townhouse at 215 West Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., a comfortable, well-appointed property that read, to any visitor, as the kind of place a wealthy foreign businessman would keep in the capital. They also acquired a yacht moored on the Potomac River for meetings with targets who needed a more private setting. Inside both locations, FBI technicians installed concealed Betamax video recording equipment. Every meeting would be recorded, every conversation captured. There would be no ambiguity about what was said or what was offered. The evidence would speak for itself. Weinberg seeded the operation through his existing contacts. The pitch was consistent. The sheikh needed help. He was a wealthy man with serious money to invest in America, but he faced obstacles, immigration issues, regulatory problems, licensing complications. He needed people who understood how Washington worked, people who could open doors, In exchange, he was prepared to pay generously. The word spread through certain networks the way such things always do, quietly through intermediaries, with the promise of discretion. The first political figures to take the bait were not members of Congress. They were local officials, city council members from Philadelphia, intermediaries and fixers who operated in the gray zones of urban politics. Their willingness to take the sheikh's money established a proof of concept. If local officials would accept bribes in exchange for political favors, what about federal legislators? The FBI expanded the operation upward. The key intermediary connecting the Bureau to Congress was a man named Howard Crichton, a Philadelphia attorney with connections to the Pennsylvania Democratic political machine. Crichton understood what Abdul Enterprises was offering, and he understood the market for it. He began approaching members of Congress with a specific proposition. The sheikh needed private immigration legislation, a bill that would grant him and associates permanent residency without going through normal channels. He was willing to pay $50,000 to any congressman who agreed to introduce such a bill. Crichton would take a cut for every introduction he arranged. The scheme was clean, simple, and deeply illegal. I spent weeks going back through the case files and the original court transcripts, and one detail kept nagging at me. These were not obscure figures on the fringes of American political life. Several of them were experienced politicians with decades in office. And yet, when the sheikh's money was placed on the table, the hesitation lasted seconds. The first congressman to be caught was Representative Michael J. Myers of Pennsylvania. Born in 1943 in Philadelphia, Myers was a first-term Democrat serving his second year in the House. On August 22, 1979, Myers met with men he believed to be the sheikh's representatives inside the W Street townhouse. The conversation was recorded in its entirety. The FBI's representative explained the arrangement. The sheikh needed immigration legislation. He was prepared to pay $50,000 for a congressman's help. Myers accepted the money without significant negotiation. Then he delivered the line that would end his political career. "Money talks in this business," Myers said, "and bullshit walks." The Betamax camera recorded everything. The audio was clean. The image was clear. Myers had just handed the prosecution everything it would ever need. What's most surprising about this case isn't that the bribery happened. It's how routine the congressman made it seem, as though accepting a cash envelope from a foreign national was simply a cost of doing business in Washington. Myers was not alone. The operation was running simultaneously on multiple tracks, with different FBI agents managing different targets. Representative Frank Thompson of New Jersey, chairman of the House Administration Committee, met with the sheikh's representatives and discussed his ability to help with immigration and other issues in exchange for payment. Representative John Murphy of New York, chairman of the House Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committee, was approached and agreed to assist. Representative Raymond Lederer of Pennsylvania met with FBI undercover agents and accepted $50,000 in cash. Representative Frank Annunzio of Illinois was approached but declined. Representative John Jenrette of South Carolina met with agents and accepted payment, his wife later recounting that she had found cash stuffed inside their closet. Representative Richard Kelly of Florida, a Republican, accepted $25,000 in cash and was filmed stuffing it into his pockets, then asking the agents, apparently in earnest, whether this constituted a bribery situation. The operation reached its apex with Senator Harrison A. Williams of New Jersey. Williams was a 23-year veteran of the Senate, a Democrat, a former chairman of the Senate Labor Committee, and by most accounts, a genuinely accomplished legislator. His case was different from the House members. The FBI did not simply offer him cash for immigration legislation. They offered him a stake in a titanium mining venture in Virginia. The sheikh's representatives explained that the mine was expected to be enormously profitable, but needed government assistance, specifically federal contracts. Williams, who would profit directly from those contracts through his hidden ownership stake in the venture, agreed to use his position to pursue them. He met with undercover agents on multiple occasions. He was recorded on video discussing his role in the scheme, his ownership stake, and his willingness to use Senate influence to secure contracts for a company from which he stood to profit personally. The ABSCAM recordings of Senator Williams were categorically different from the House cases. This was not a cash payment for a single piece of legislation. This was a sitting senator discussing a sustained corrupt arrangement, on camera in specific detail, over multiple meetings. When prosecutors eventually reviewed the tapes, they understood immediately what they had. Here's the take that will probably draw some disagreement. The FBI's use of Mel Weinberg was the right call, and anyone who criticizes the operation primarily on entrapment grounds is missing the more important point. The defense attorneys in these cases argued, not without some logic, that the Bureau had manufactured a criminal opportunity and then invited people into it. But the entrapment argument requires believing that these men would not have taken a bribe otherwise, that only the FBI's specific approach unlocked a corruption they would otherwise have contained. The recordings do not support that interpretation. The ease with which the money was accepted, the familiarity with which the arrangements were discussed, the speed of the negotiations, all of it suggests men who had done this before, or who had thought about it seriously, or who lived in a world where this was considered normal. The FBI did not create the corruption, it found it. The operation came within hours of catastrophic exposure in early 1980. A journalist at the Camden Courier-Post had picked up fragments of the story through law enforcement sources and was preparing to publish. The FBI learned of the impending story on a Friday. The decision was made immediately. The sting had to close before the story ran. Over the weekend of February 2nd and 3rd, 1980, agents rushed to execute final meetings and secure final recordings. The article ran in the Courier-Post on Sunday, February 3rd, 1980, and by that evening, the operation was effectively over. The Bureau had gotten what it needed, but only just. If the story had broken 2 weeks earlier, several of the congressional targets might never have been caught on tape. Now the cases had to hold up in court, and that was not going to be simple. The defense bar mobilized immediately around one central argument: entrapment. The claim was that government agents had induced otherwise law-abiding citizens to commit crimes they would not otherwise have committed, and that convictions obtained through such methods violated constitutional principles of due process. It was a powerful argument in the abstract. The problem for the defendants was the videotape. You cannot argue your way around 40 hours of video evidence. When a jury watches a United States congressman accept $50,000 in cash, smile, and say that money talks in this business, the entrapment argument loses most of its force. The juries in the ABSCAM cases were confronted with this reality again and again, and they drew the obvious conclusion. The trials proceeded through 1980 and 1981. The first conviction came on August 30th, 1980, when Representative Michael Myers was found guilty of bribery and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. On October 2nd, 1980, the House of Representatives voted 376-30 to expel Myers from Congress. The first expulsion of a House member since the Civil War, when 3 representatives were removed for supporting the Confederacy. Myers served the full term. He was released, ran for his old seat again in 1982, lost and faded from public life. Representative John Jenrette of South Carolina was convicted on October 7, 1980, on bribery and conspiracy charges. He resigned from Congress before he could be expelled. Representative Raymond Lederer of Pennsylvania was convicted in January 1981. He initially refused to resign and was re-elected in November 1980, while his conviction was on appeal. But he resigned in April 1981 after it became clear the House was going to vote to expel him. Representative Frank Thompson of New Jersey, once one of the most powerful members of the House, was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. Representative John Murphy of New York was convicted of bribery and conflict of interest charges. Representative Richard Kelly of Florida, who had been filmed stuffing cash into his pockets, was convicted despite his attempt to claim that he had been conducting his own private investigation of the Sheikh's representatives. Put yourself in the position of the jurors in the Kelly case for a moment. You have just watched video of a sitting United States congressman accept $25,000 in cash and stuff it into his jacket pockets. His defense is that he was investigating the Sheikh on his own, without telling the FBI, without telling any law enforcement authority, without keeping any record of what he was discovering. The jury deliberated briefly. Kelly was convicted. The case of Senator Harrison Williams was the most consequential and the most contested. Williams went to trial in the spring of 1981. His defense argued entrapment and outrageous government conduct, that the FBI had specifically designed the titanium mine scheme to trap him, that Weinberg had manipulated the presentation, that Williams had never clearly committed to using his Senate position and had in fact been trying to back away from the arrangement. The prosecution played the tapes. The jury watched Williams on video discussing his hidden ownership stake and his willingness to pursue federal contracts for the venture. On May 1, 1981, Harrison Williams was convicted on 9 counts of bribery, conspiracy, and accepting an unlawful gratuity. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. Williams appealed the conviction. He argued that statements made by Vice President Walter Mondale about the case had been prejudicial, that the entrapment defense had been improperly handled, that the government's conduct had been so outrageous as to constitute a due process violation. The appeals courts rejected each argument. The Supreme Court declined to hear the case. On March 11, 1982, facing certain expulsion from the Senate, Harrison A. Williams of New Jersey resigned. He was the first sitting United States Senator to be convicted of a crime and resigned from office since the Teapot Dome scandal of the 1920s. He served 21 months in federal prison and was released in 1986. One detail from the Williams case has stayed with me. In the recordings, Williams is not visibly nervous. He speaks with the calm authority of a man who has spent decades in the United States Senate. He discusses his hidden stake in a corrupt arrangement with the ease of someone talking through a real estate investment. Whatever he thought he was risking, it was not enough to make him cautious. He had been in Washington long enough to believe, apparently, that this was survivable. He was wrong. The mayor of Camden, New Jersey, Angelo Ericetti, was perhaps the most colorful figure in the entire ABSCAM, cast outside of Weinberg himself. Ericetti was simultaneously a state senator and the mayor of a struggling post-industrial city, and he operated at the intersection of New Jersey politics and organized crime with a confidence that bordered on theatrical. He became one of Weinberg's most useful connections, helping to broker introductions to congressmen and offering his own services to the sheikh in exchange for payment. He was convicted of bribery and conspiracy in 1981 and sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. Several members of the Philadelphia City Council were also convicted on charges arising from ABSCAM meetings. The legal legacy of ABSCAM was almost as significant as the convictions. The operation triggered a fundamental reassessment of how the FBI could conduct undercover operations, targeting public officials. Critics argued that the operation had been insufficiently supervised, that the Bureau had been too aggressive in its targeting, that prosecutors and agents had essentially gone shopping for corrupt officials without adequate predication. The Justice Department agreed to a significant extent. In 1981, the department issued new guidelines governing undercover operations involving public officials. Such operations would require higher-level authorization going forward. They would require documented predication, evidence suggesting that specific targets were already engaged in corrupt conduct before the sting began. The days of broad, target-rich fishing expeditions through the political world were over. Here's what this case tells us about that particular moment in American history. ABSCAM happened in the aftermath of Watergate, at a time when trust in government institutions was at historic lows. The FBI was itself trying to rehabilitate its reputation after the revelations about J. Edgar Hoover's abuses. And yet, paradoxically, the operation that most vividly demonstrated the rot in elected government was itself later questioned for going too far. The lesson is not that the Bureau was wrong to pursue corruption. The lesson is that the methods by which power investigates power will always be contested, because power has a stake in that contest. There is a secondary story inside ABSCAM that rarely gets told in full, and it concerns what happened to Melvin Weinberg. Weinberg received a suspended sentence for his prior fraud convictions, as agreed. He also received a cash payment from the FBI. Reports at the time placed the figure in the range of several $100,000, though the exact amount was disputed. Weinberg later cooperated with the production of the 2013 film American Hustle, which dramatized the ABSCAM operation in loosely fictionalized form. He objected to certain aspects of the film's portrayal of him, but by that point he was in his late 80s, and there was not much he could do about it. He died in 2020 at the age of 93. The film version of ABSCAM, told through the prism of the con artist at its center, is considerably more romantic than the reality. The real Weinberg was not a lovable rogue trying to find redemption. He was a skilled operator who had spent his life defrauding people, and who cooperated with the FBI because the alternative was prison. The FBI used him because he was extraordinarily effective, not because anyone particularly admired him. That transactional reality is closer to the truth of how these operations work than any Hollywood version could be. What do you think? When the government uses a convicted fraudster to catch corrupt politicians, does the integrity of the justice system survive intact? Drop your answer in the comments. There's no clean answer, and anyone who tells you there is hasn't read the case file. The question of whether ABSCAM was entrapment never fully resolved in the public mind, even after the courts ruled consistently against the defendants. The entrapment argument is seductive because it carries an implicit reassurance. If the government manufactured the crime, then the officials were not really corrupt and the system is not really broken. The recordings made that reassurance impossible. The officials were corrupt. The system was broken, at least in those specific places and those specific people. The FBI did not create what it found. It documented it. Several of the convicted congressmen tried to return to public life after their sentences. Michael Myers ran for his House seat again in 1982 and lost. He continued attempting political comebacks in subsequent decades, most recently winning a race for a local Democratic ward position in Philadelphia in 2020, before being federally indicted again, this time for ballot fraud, and convicted in 2023. Raymond Lederer returned to Philadelphia after his sentence and largely disappeared from public view. Harrison Williams rebuilt a private legal consulting career after his release from prison. He died in 2001. The men who had sat in the rooms at W Street and on the Potomac yacht and accepted the Sheikh's money mostly outlived the scandal, though none of them recovered what they had lost. The townhouse at 215 West Street was eventually sold. The yacht was returned to wherever yachts go when investigations end. The Betamax tapes, the original recordings that captured everything, went into FBI evidence storage, and copies were entered into court records where they remain accessible today. 40-plus hours of video showing American elected officials accepting cash in exchange for political favors, recorded with technology that was cutting edge in 1979 and obsolete within a decade. The recording format changed. The behavior on the tapes did not. If you want to go deeper, the full unedited recordings from the Williams Townhouse meetings are part of the public court record and have been partially transcribed in the legal literature. They read in stretches like a very dark comedy. Williams explains how he will pursue the contracts. He explains the structure of the titanium venture. He is measured, senatorial, authoritative. He sounds exactly like a senior legislator who knows how the system works, which is, of course, precisely the problem. The FBI's operation team from ABSCAM never received a significant public commendation. The case was successful, but it was also controversial. And in Washington, controversial cases do not generate ticker tape parades. The agents moved on to other assignments. Special Agent James Foran, who had managed Weinberg, continued his career with the Bureau. The case file was closed. The guidelines were rewritten. The lessons were absorbed, or were supposed to be. Congress, as an institution, responded to ABSCAM the way institutions typically respond to exposures of internal corruption, with a period of visible reform followed by a gradual return to normal. Ethics rules were strengthened. Disclosure requirements were increased. Oversight mechanisms were enhanced. Whether any of it fundamentally changed the culture of political corruption that ABSCAM had documented is a question that subsequent history has answered, periodically and uncomfortably, in the negative. Team Myers or Team Williams? Which conviction do you think mattered more for American history? Comment below because there's a real argument on both sides of that question, and the answer tells you something about what you think government is actually for. The legacy of ABSCAM lives in 3 places simultaneously. It lives in the Department of Justice guidelines that still govern how the FBI runs undercover operations targeting public officials. Rules that require predication, oversight, and documented justification before any such operation can proceed. It lives in the law school casebooks and the Quantico training programs, where the operation is studied as a model of what undercover work can accomplish and a warning of how it can go too far. And it lives in the footage, those extraordinary, improbable, devastating recordings of men in suits accepting money from a sheikh who did not exist, in rooms wired by the federal government for conduct that was entirely, indisputably real. Mel Weinberg once said, in one of his later interviews, that the operation worked because he understood one thing about human nature that the FBI had never formally codified. People who want something badly enough, he said, will convince themselves that the risk is manageable. They will talk themselves into it. They do not need to be pressured. They need to be given an opportunity and then left alone long enough to make their own choice. The FBI gave 7 members of Congress and several city officials that opportunity. Every single one of them made the same choice. The Sheikh, Kambir Abdul Rahman, was never real. The embassy he supposedly represented did not exist. The money was government funds tracked to the penny. But the corruption it uncovered was entirely genuine. That is the paradox at the heart of ABSCAM, a fiction that revealed a fact. A con designed to catch con men. An operation built on deception that produced the most unambiguous evidence of political bribery in American history. If this is the kind of case you want more of, the ones where the FBI went places the official record rarely discusses, subscribe now and hit the bell. We cover the full files, the parts that made it to trial and the parts that didn't.